Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Ulrich, and I'm the director at NYU Washington, D.C. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Abramson Family Auditorium for tonight's program, Understanding the Fight Against Human Trafficking. Thank you to Tom McIntyre, Lauren Hunt, Mike Yeager, and all of our student volunteers who helped make tonight's event possible. I am pleased to welcome our moderator for tonight's program, Janie Schwang. Janie is a professor of law working in the areas of international law, human trafficking, and labor migration. She has served as an advisor to the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, and the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And there's a lot more to read, but we're not going to do that tonight. But she's a very distinguished moderator. Thank you for being here. I'd also like to offer a very warm welcome for tonight's distinguished speakers, Senator Heidi Heitkamp and Mrs. Cindy McCain. I will now hand it over to Janie to introduce our special guests and begin what I'm sure will be an engaging and insightful program on the fight against human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you to NYU for hosting this very important discussion today, and thank you to Senator Heitkamp and Mrs. McCain for taking time out of your very busy schedule to come join us and provide your insights on how best to address the problem of human trafficking. So I've worked on trafficking issues for 20 years now, both as a lawyer and as an academic, and in that time span I've witnessed tremendous changes in the field. Whereas much of early anti-trafficking efforts focused almost entirely on the trafficking of women and girls into the sex sector, we have finally come to understand trafficking as a phenomenon that affects men, women, and children in a wide range of sectors that affect our daily lives. We now recognize that trafficking can take place on farms that produce the food we eat, and in the factories along the supply chains that produce the clothes we wear, and that trafficking can occur in private homes, in the treatment of domestic workers who care for our children, our elderly, and our disabled, and even in our public schools, in the deceptive and abusive recruitment of teachers from abroad. Now, just as our understanding of the breadth and nature of the problem has evolved, so have our responses. Trafficking is no longer viewed as eradicated solely through aggressive prosecutorial efforts. We're increasingly understanding that we must also attend to the root causes of the problem. These include, for example, in the countries from which trafficked people originate, the lack of economic and educational opportunities, compelling individuals to migrate under precarious conditions in hopes of finding a means for basic economic survival. Or in the destination countries like the United States, the lack of basic worker protections against retaliatory termination and deportation for guest workers, and even undocumented workers who report abusive working conditions and abusive recruitment practices. Or in the case of trafficking within our own borders, the failure to provide adequate care and shelter to our homeless and runaway youth. This confluence of factors, among so many others, have contributed to our current situation, where an estimated 20.9 million people around the world are trafficked or in forced labor. Thankfully, what is undeniably an immense global problem has inspired a deep and ever-growing commitment on the part of governments, international organizations, NGOs, corporations, philanthropies, and individuals like yourselves to take part in global efforts to eradicate human trafficking. I have the great privilege today of moderating a discussion with two of the leading voices in the anti-trafficking movement, Senator Heidi Heitkamp and Mrs. Cindy McCain. So the format for today is such that I will briefly introduce our distinguished speakers and then spend about 30 minutes in discussion prompted by a series of questions that I've prepared in advance and shared with our speakers. And then we'll open up the discussion to questions from the audience, after which we'll conclude with closing statements from Mrs. McCain and Senator Heitkamp. So to introduce Senator Heitkamp, U.S. Senator Heitkamp is the first female senator elected from North Dakota. In her first term, she has quickly become a leader among her colleagues in the fight against human trafficking, first sounding the alarm bells on human trafficking as a law enforcement issue in the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs in 2013, where she now serves as ranking member on the Subcommittee on Regulatory Affairs and Federal Management. She co-sponsored and helped pass the Justice for Victims of Human Trafficking Act, which President Obama signed into law, which helped secure stricter punishments for traffickers and included her bill to provide safe harbor laws nationwide to make sure victims of these crimes are treated as victims, not criminals. After working to hold the CEO of Backpage.com, a site notoriously used by traffickers to buy and sell victims, accountable for refusing to testify on his company's failure to disclose safeguards against trafficking, She voted to hold him in civil contempt of Congress, the first time the Senate has done so in 20 years. Earlier this year, Senator Heitkamp challenged leadership of Backpage for its role in the facilitation of human trafficking on its site when the U.S. Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs' Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, on which she serves, released a report finding the company knowingly facilitated online sex trafficking. She recently reintroduced her bipartisan SOAR Act to make sure health workers have the training they need to identify and help protect victims they frequently see, and will keep fighting to make sure our most vulnerable, our runaway and homeless youth, don't fall prey to these crimes. Senator Heitkamp continues to work to build a strong global network of support against these crimes, traveling to Mexico, Central America, and across the country, as well as engaging North Dakota community leaders and law enforcement in the fight against these crimes with multiple U.S. State Department of Homeland Security trainings. I'm also pleased to introduce Mrs. Cindy McCain. Mrs. Cindy Hensley McCain has spent her life fighting on behalf of women and children and has been a strong leader in the fight against human trafficking. She works seamlessly across political, public, and private lines and has engaged with the National Football League, the International Center for Sports Security, both the Democratic and Republican National Committees, Polaris, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Google, and many other organizations to work to eradicate human trafficking. She has advised members in the fight against trafficking in London, Kenya, Congo, Cambodia, and the Ivory Coast. Mrs. McCain serves as co-chair of the Arizona Governor's Council on Human Trafficking and on the McCain Institute's Human Trafficking Advisory Council. She is dedicated to efforts to reduce human trafficking in Arizona, throughout the United States and around the world, as well as working to improve the lives of victims of human trafficking. Through her work with the McCain Institute, several partnerships have been formed with anti-trafficking organizations working on solving various aspects of the problem. Mrs. McCain has worked to shed a light on the different facets of everyday life that are affected by human trafficking, such as law enforcement, healthcare, the internet, and child welfare systems. She addresses human trafficking at the international level by heading directly to the front lines of the world with the most vulnerable populations subject to human trafficking. On the shorelines of Greece and Turkey, Mrs. McCain worked with organizations to educate refugees on the signs of human trafficking and how to avoid falling prey to traffickers. She has traveled extensively around the world, learning more about the issue and the multitude of ways to fight this heinous crime. She is on the board of directors of Project Cure and also sits on the advisory boards of Too Small to Fail and Warriors and Quiet Waters. Mrs. McCain holds an undergraduate degree in education and a master's in special education from USC and is a member of USC Rossier School of Education Board of Counselors. Mrs. Cindy Hensley McCain passionately fights to stop human trafficking by convening academics, politicians, corporation officials, and technology experts to work together to stop this crime against humanity. So I'm going to lead off the discussion with a question to both of you. So how did you first get involved in the trafficking field?
Cindy, why don't you start, because you tell such a fantastic story, and I'll look really bad if you tell that story after me.
First of all, I'm so glad to be here, and I hope that we together can have a good discussion tonight. The first time I ever saw human trafficking, I did not know what it was. I was traveling in India. I had just finished some work that we were doing in Calcutta, and we have a daughter from Bangladesh, so I was out trying to buy some sari material for her, and finished what I was doing in the kiosk and was, busy with that. And Calcutta is a very vibrant, exciting, all the noise and just everything going on outside and inside. As I went to go pay the gentleman that owned the kiosk, I could kind of hear this kind of cluttering coming from below the floor, like noise, things being moved around. And I asked him what it was, and he said, "Oh, it's just my family. They live below the floorboards." Very plausible in a place like this, very, very possible. But when I went to lay the money on the counter, I looked down, and you could kind of see between the slats and the floorboards, not a lot, but enough. I know I looked at least 50 sets of little eyes. And they were all little girls, and they were all, you know, they weren't all his, that's for sure. But what I did is I didn't do anything. I didn't know what I was looking at. I didn't know what, I just couldn't fathom what was going on. So I walked out of that kiosk, got on my nice airplane home, went back to my lovely home with my lovely family, and didn't do anything. But what it did do was spur me on to find out just what it was. And so this has been a long quest for me to not only understand the issue completely, but also figure out a way that we can stop this stuff. It's horrible. So for me, it was like, you know, you can turn something bad into something good, and I'm just grateful that I had the experience and can actually be in a position of being able to do something now.
Well, for me, I'm the former Attorney General from North Dakota. And one of the reasons why I ran in 92 is at the time the domestic violence programs in my state and across the country were in the public health arena. This was not considered a criminal justice issue. If you think about it, in 1992, we were attacking this as if it was a family problem. And there was ongoing and consistent tension between law enforcement and the advocates at that time. If you ever want to see when people say you'll never get people to get along who had that much animosity towards each other, you should look at the seamless work that law enforcement in many, many states and domestic violence advocates are doing today to combat domestic violence. And so that was kind of my frame of reference. And when I ran for the United States Senate in 2012, I went and visited all my law enforcement friends who started talking to me about, you know, because it was a time of a tremendous growth in North Dakota, the Bakken boom. And a lot of people were saying, Heidi, we've never seen this level of prostitution before. And we just don't have time to investigate it. We're investigating assaults in bars, we're investigating murders, we're investigating thefts. We just haven't had time to investigate this prostitution, but we see it everywhere. And I got to thinking about this prostitution in North Dakota, what that actually meant. And just like Cindy, you know, started kind of rethinking what that meant in my state and why that was, and started really learning about what goes on when people buy other human beings so that they can resell them to other human beings, and when they capture and imprison other human beings so that they can resell other human beings. Now, the easiest place here in terms of public policy is obviously minors, is getting the word prostitution out of the language as we arrest minors, beginning to address what we do with people who purchase children, whether we treat them as typical, you know, people engaged in the sex trade and as Johns as opposed to child predators and pedophiles. And so we have a whole language around prostitution that doesn't really fit with what's going on and the heinous nature of this crime. Now, to give you an idea of how difficult it is to begin to have that discussion, not only in law enforcement circles, but a discussion about how we as a society ought to look at commercial sex, we began this discussion about what do the laws say and how should we change these laws. And honestly, my first interest came as a result of what I was seeing with indigenous women, Native American women who escaped the life and were in recovery in places like Minneapolis has a recovery center that's incredible. And the stories that they would tell of being sold by their cousins, sold by their families for a fix or for just money and just literally thrown away. And when you look at the dynamics of domestic violence and you look at the dynamics of trafficking, the one thing that is a constant is the devaluing of that person. You know, if you want to get someone in a position where you can, in fact, abuse them in a family relationship, you devalue them first. And when you want to take a child who already probably is susceptible, you devalue that child. And that's why a lot of what we really need to talk about in this lane really goes to the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program. I like saying it this way. I think there's a lot of people out there involved in this who who think this is Laura Ingalls Wilder bounding through the prairie, running to Ma and Pa, and some dark force in the world swoops her up and carries her away to this evil place. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, and I'm not saying there aren't a lot of victims who fit that profile, but fundamentally the victims who fit the profile are kids who've been thrown away. They're kids who have run away. They're kids who are vulnerable on the street, probably engaging in survival sex at some point, which devalues them, and it just takes the next step. And so we have to start looking at this issue differently. And the same way we morphed from thinking that this was a family problem and that this was a problem of public health in domestic violence, we have to start being very, very serious as a society in addressing the victimization that happens in commercial sex. And where we talk about minors, because that seems to be kind of that entry point, almost all the women that I've met who are in the life or who began in this life began as minors. And so to simply draw that harsh line and say, well, because you're 18, you no longer have the protections that we want to see for other women, or for girls, seems really harsh. And so we've got a lot of work to do in terms of our cultural change, but it has to begin with changing the dynamic like we did in domestic violence and really begin to be very honest about how complacent we are as a society and how willing we are to turn away from this whole problem of human slavery, particularly human sex slavery.
Thank you. So one of the, and picking up on this point about child victims of sex trafficking, one of the most troubling statistics that I've come across in recent years concerns restitution to victims. The Human Trafficking Pro Bono Legal Center, a fabulous NGO, put out a report a couple of years ago that found through enormous research of prosecution dockets across the country, found that in only 36% of trafficking prosecutions did prosecutors actually ask for restitution to victims. Now that is a mandatory requirement, right? Prosecutors are supposed to ask for restitution. And restitution is very important in order to fund aftercare, right? Continuing care to deal with the trauma and the other needs of the victims of trafficking. And I'm wondering, yet only 36% of trafficking prosecutions did we find that the request was even made. So I'm wondering if you might speak to why that is, and what do you think we could do about that problem? And I'll also add that the least likely to receive restitution was found to be child victims of sex trafficking.
Well, there's a number of issues, and I know Heidi can speak to this as well. But number one, first of all, getting a child into court to testify against a trafficker is a monumental feat. Mm-hmm. Most of the time they run. Once they get them in, do they have to face them to testify against them, or are they allowed to video testify? That's an issue right now in Arizona. There's a number of factors, so getting to the point of, quote, restitution is a long, long road. Now, with that said, it's the law. I completely agree with you. But until we can actually educate our prosecutors on the difficulty that it is to get a child into court, we're not going to get anywhere on this. And we're going to continue to see low numbers, less prosecutions, and really more just disappear, kids that disappear as a result of it.
You know, when I was Attorney General, I started a special unit in my office. You can imagine North Dakota's, there's only 1,400 sworn peace officers in all of North Dakota, to give you a sense of kind of the population base. And there are prosecutors in Fargo, there's prosecutors in Grand Forks, our major cities who are well equipped to handle that kind of prosecution. But if it happens in Slope County, or if it these counties that are very sparsely populated where there's a very part-time prosecutor or state's attorney, it's really difficult to develop the expertise to do these cases. And on child sexual assault, cases when you say, well, that's not trafficking, absolutely it's trafficking. It's the same trauma, and worse trauma than sexual assault that doesn't involve repeated behaviors. But if you look at it, we need to have a whole different look on how we address prosecutions and how we address victimization in the courtroom. And so it's going to require continue and ongoing training for prosecutors, for judges, because frequently judges will not grant leniency in terms of videotaped. They'll say you have a right to confront your accuser. So these are all challenges in any kind of child sexual assault prosecution. There are also challenges in adult sexual assault where people just don't want to live through this experience again, and that's what it requires. And so we need highly trained prosecutors. We need specialized units in states like mine that actually are equipped and trained to handle these kinds of investigations and these kinds of prosecutions, because you can have the best prosecutor in the world, but if the investigation's botched, it's going to be awfully hard to prove up this assault. This is where our bill on SOAR, which would require training in hospitals, comes into focus. And so when we recently on the back page hearing, we heard from a number of mothers whose children had been trafficked and the challenges that they had. And I asked a simple question. I said, what would you like to see done that would have changed outcomes for your child? And both of them said better training in emergency rooms. They felt that their children had been, that was a point of intervention. And then when they actually showed up for the investigative forensic exam, no one knew how to do a forensic exam that involved a trafficked victim. It was just, it wasn't that what you would expect in a sexual assault case. It was much more complicated. And so we need to get the resources to develop the best practices, like we did in domestic violence prosecutions, where we went ahead in prosecution without victim testimony. Frequently in domestic violence prosecutions that happens because frequently the victim will recant because of the power relationship that they're in. And so we've got to have trained units. And when we train those units, they aren't going to question that formula that you asked for restitution. It would be interesting, though, I asked the professor, of restitution that's ordered, how much of that is actually paid?
Even
Yeah.
less.
So having the judgment is one thing. The ability to be paid and to execute on that judgment is another huge challenge. But like I said, this is going to take really specialized units in states, especially like mine, but really all across the country. And the states that have been the most successful are states that have these units. Minneapolis is a great example. Ramsey County does a great job. They have great investigators. They have great prosecutors. And so it's not like you have to reinvent the wheel. I think that we should be doing more to build that capacity within the prosecutorial world, because it will go a long way.
Great, thank you. So I want to continue on the prosecution line and ask about the disparity in the number of prosecutions pursued for sex trafficking versus labor trafficking. So just to throw out some statistics, this is both globally and here in the United States. So in the United States, in the year 2015, only 9 out of 957 prosecutions initiated were of labor trafficking. Globally, out of 18,930 prosecutions, only 857 prosecutions were of labor trafficking. I wonder if you might speak to how we might be able to promote more proactive investigation of labor trafficking cases around the world and here in the United States.
Well, you've got the story, Cindy. You're on this.
You ask a good question, and this is a problem, as you said, all across the country. Labor trafficking is grossly underreported for many, many reasons, primarily the most being that the companies that are actually using trafficked labor and know they're using trafficked labor aren't going to report anything, and they're not going to report to the supply chain entities that this is actually going on. There's another portion of this, though, and the McCain Institute actually has a project that's just beginning in Texas on just this issue, working with prosecutors, is educating prosecutors on the issue. It's convoluted many times. Not all labor traffic victims are illegal. Many of them are legal within the United States. So making our prosecutors understand the depth of the issue, what it is, what to do, all the things that you and I know sitting here, but that many prosecutors, particularly in rural counties, don't know or don't believe it's even going on. And also making sure that in the larger perspective of this, is making sure that companies who are sourcing the fruits and vegetables or the textiles or whatever it may be are doing due diligence on supply chains. This is something that I would like to see the United States not only take on officially and make companies accountable for what's going on within their supply chains to the best of their ability, understanding that there are going to be some problems that they probably can't find or won't find in time. But everyone has to play a part in this, and I no longer, and I think Heidi agrees with me, accept the fact that a company just didn't know.
Yeah.
There's too many resources out there now. So from that aspect, I think it's very important. Now, before I hand it off to Heidi, where we're working in Texas, the prosecutors in that part of the state they said to us, it doesn't exist. It's not a problem here. Texas. I mean, so we're kind of starting at ground zero in many places on this issue.
Well, I give credit to the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, who began a Blue campaign. It's in its early stages, but when their trainers go out to talk about to local prosecutors, they don't restrict it to the sex trafficking. They talk about labor trafficking. They talk about domestic help, what to look for, how to kind of spot it. And I think the beginning stage is to build an awareness that this actually happens. We have modern day slavery in our country. There are people who are enslaved, who are marginalized, and who go to work every day and earn not a dime. And so it's like sex trafficking. When we began this discussion in Western North Dakota, I remember going to a meeting. Cindy was there with me in a little town called Watford City, and we got around a table and we're talking about this problem, and there were some community leaders there, and you could just kind of see them roll their eyes. They didn't do it, because they probably would have if I had been there, but they weren't going to do it to Cindy. So they're just like, you could see, they just thought we were exaggerating this, and this was just the yak until the chief of police said today on back pages there are 20 advertisements for commercial sex in Watford City. Yeah. And it was like dead silence in that room, because the reality of that had to be recognized. Now, I know, think about this, we had a massive labor shortage in my state during the oil boom. Any one of you who thinks there wasn't labor trafficking, there wasn't modern day slavery, I think we'd be too naive. Not one report of it. So frequently it's done, the guy who's running the hotel desperately needs people to perform janitorial services, maids to clean up. They can't find the workforce to hire directly. They contract. They don't look much beyond that contract price. And so what's really happening there? Are those people actually getting paid? Are they getting paid fairly? And at a time when you have a big explosion of work, are the investigators actually showing up, the labor investigators, to find out what's going on? And so we need better training to identify this problem, and we need better training for prosecutors to prosecute this problem. We think anywhere from 20 to 30 million people in the world are currently enslaved. Anyone here who believes that none of those people are in our country, you're wrong. because we're a very vibrant economy, and just as people will look for a market for sex trafficking, people are going to look for a market for labor trafficking, and I think that it's not on purpose. I want to ask you, you're all here. How many of you saw a story about a note in a purse? Okay, so a couple of you. And this has happened,
Yeah.
I guess, occasionally,
In
where
Arizona.
someone buys a purse at a big box store, or buys something at a big box store, opens it up, and there's a note. This note happened to be written in Chinese. This woman took it to someone who was a translator, who then translated it. And the note pretty much said, I'm imprisoned. We don't know if she was in prison and it was prison labor, if she was imprisoned, but she clearly was crying out for help to anyone who bought that purse. And so it shouldn't take someone writing a note in a purse
Right.
for us to ask people. And I happened to have a meeting that week with the company. I won't say who it was, so you can check it out
Oh, I
yourself.
will.
Yeah, you do. And they were very receptive. I said, I'd really like to know what you're doing in your supply chain, because it may have been 3 steps removed from this company.
Right.
But somehow when we are the largest economy of the world, purchasing these goods and services, I think we have a greater obligation to make sure that the people producing these goods and services are not slaves. And we can leverage that economic strength that we have for, I think, a very good purpose, which is ending slavery in our world.
Thank you. So to pick up on the point of the fact that trafficking occurs right here within our borders, I wanted to raise an issue that came up at a recent conference sponsored by the Freedom Network. It was a conference that brought together hundreds of advocates working, direct service providers who work with trafficked people. And there was a persistent theme that came across during the conference, which was a very deep concern about the impact that heightened immigration enforcement could have on trafficking victims coming forward to report abuse. As you very rightly said, and I'm so glad that you clarified for the audience that many trafficked persons are here in the United States in documented status, but we do have a lot of undocumented people who are trafficked here in the United States. And I'm wondering what we might be able to do, or what you think we ought to do about trafficked persons who are undocumented, who now, because of heightened immigration enforcement, may be all the more wary of interacting with government agencies to report the abuse that they're suffering.
Well, I'll take this one first. This power relationship has created a real vulnerability in trafficking, and it was bad before. I mean, you all have read the stories of things that have happened in the fields where somebody who's a supervisor feels like they can just take a woman out of the field, rape her, and then send her back to work in the same morning. So this was happening before we had this heightened awareness within the community that there will be additional enforcement actions taken. I believe personally that it has, in fact, made people who were already incredibly vulnerable even more vulnerable. How we need to address that, I think, is going to be with a lot of education and a lot of awareness about what happens with vulnerable people, but it also requires that people who wear the label of citizens begin to speak out. And I know we can get into a discussion about sanctuary cities. We can get into a discussion about kind of zones of protection that would not result in deportation with reports. We need to figure that piece out, because it's not an American value to let that happen in our country. It's not an American value. And when people can act with impunity, because they have no fear of retribution, no fear of prosecution, we only add to the vulnerability. And so I don't know that I have the answer, but I am very concerned, as the question would suggest you are, that this has in fact created an even greater opportunity for really bad people to do really bad things.
I see two things in this. Number one, the litigious society that we live in now it has driven so many people to say, I don't want to get involved. You know, I don't know what could happen, so count me out on this whole thing. That has to change, because this issue has to be one that you engage in, period, if we're ever going to stop it. And secondly, this is also a cry to be able to further educate, train, and make aware our local law enforcement, the guys are actually on the ground that come across this. Because traffic victims are handled differently. But as to your point, we are going to have to do something that will enable these people to, number one, not be trafficked, but number two, if they are trafficked and frightened, to come forward not so frightened. And I don't know what that is. That's the job for my husband and Heidi here. But it is. It is one thing that you, as I hope, activists, humanitarians, lawyers, whatever your future lies ahead for you, this is up to you. This is your time. We're in a perfect storm on this issue now, and it is incumbent on all of us to get involved in this on a daily basis.
Great, thank you. So we have reached the point of the program where we open up the forum to questions from the audience. I believe there may be a microphone, maybe not, or maybe we can have our questioners stand up, identify yourself, please.
We could read the
and we can also repeat the question. So hands, anybody who's interested in answering? Yes. Do you want to go ahead, right here in the front? You. Good, okay.
Hi, Zeb Trin from AU. I originally came from California, Northern, and I'm very aware what's going on in San Francisco. Now, Senator Kamala Harris had made it her first priority immigration issue, and of course, she's former Attorney General. So I wanted to ask you, the last thing you said, because of discrimination and the enforcement today, most victims who are undocumented would never dare report rapes and going on. So does that kind of, my question is, does that kind of reinforce the issue that you bring up? Because if they go out and report the rape, then they get deported. And that's the situation Senator Kamala Harris was saying as a former Attorney General.
Well, I really respect the work that Senator Harris is doing. She's a great addition. She's on our committee, our Homeland Security Committee, and raising these issues every day. What I would tell you is that anytime you have people who are diminished in power, and that clearly someone who is working, picking tomatoes, and then undocumented is someone who is marginalized. You're going to create a vulnerability, and if you don't give them the power to step up without endangering their own self, you will create a very toxic environment for continuing the kind of abuse that we know happens every day in America. So we need to figure this out. I can't tell you what we need to do, but we need to make sure that the Department of Homeland Security is engaged and understands the challenges of these families. One great example, recently there was a discussion about whether women who presented at the border from Central America fleeing, the murder capital of the world, right? The countries of the world, who would have their baby taken away from them if they came to the border as a deterrent or as some way to prevent them from even coming. And we received a lot of letters, and we raised this issue with Secretary Kelly when he appeared in front of our committee, and he committed to us that he wouldn't. This is again another area that we should be raising with the leadership of the Department of Homeland Security, saying, how do you balance this? Just allowing this to continue to give kind of, open season on people who are vulnerable to be victims of crime, and then making them fearful for even reporting it. How do we solve that problem? And I think we need to have that discussion with the Department of Homeland Security as they're pursuing their policies, because, and the public needs to know that this occurs, and they need to weigh in, because I don't think there's anyone I know in North Dakota who thinks that a woman, even if she's undocumented and raped, should not have access to justice. And that's really what we're talking about, because deterrence can work up to a point, but if there's no deterrence, if there is no prosecution, if there is no opportunity for intervention by authorities, then we have a condition that is greatly exacerbated going forward. So my pledge to you is the next time, talk to your senator, who I like a lot, and talk about this issue and whether we can raise it with the Department of Homeland Security.
How about to the right?
Hi, I'm Shafali. I actually work in agriculture in Minnesota, and both of you come from very heavy agricultural states. And I do a lot of work on supply chains. It's probably not a surprise to you, we don't really talk about human trafficking as we should. So the question is to both of you is, what can private companies who have a lot of supplier power do to actually create the right incentives to start addressing this problem, and with the caveat of not scaring people, because we've already talked about sometimes the pressure comes down and it actually creates the wrong behavior, but positive things you think that these big ag and food companies can really do to help what you're addressing?
Well, as I said before, I think our senators and congressmen offering incentives for companies to do just that, do the right thing, not the wrong thing. There are plenty of tools, as you know, out there for companies to be able to research supply chains and research what's going on. And there's also, as you know, NGOs that will actually do it for them and report back to them. So in my opinion, and I take a hard line on this, in my opinion, in this day and age, there is no reason for a company to say, I don't know how to do this. I can't do it. It's too overwhelming. So I don't buy that at all. In the case that Heidi just raised about the letter, the Chinese letter inside the purse, that happened in Arizona. Unfortunately for the company involved, they hit the one state, or there's many states, but the one state that's really hard on this issue on these guys. So I know that our governor's after them now. I mean, this has opened up a whole lot of different issues on this. And it's too bad we have to have an example, that somebody's made a mistake and now there's an example. There should be no examples. But as far as incentives, Heidi can maybe answer that a little better than I can, of what kind of incentives you would offer, if that would be what you do.
Well, I think, first off, Cindy is so modest. She really is. She convenes at the Sedona Forum, where really the attendees look like the Fortune 100. And every noon at the Sedona Forum, since I've been going there, she tells all of these CEOs what they need to be doing to stop trafficking in the world. So she's being very, and that kind of shout out, that kind of, we're watching you, this could in fact affect, how people perceive your business.
Yeah.
This is in fact your brand, and you don't want your brand to be associated with trafficking. And so don't underestimate the bully pulpit and what it means when you shine the big light on it and people say, okay, that's not something that I want to be part of. I think that the best thing that we can do is continue to push through corporate governance structures, saying this is first off a value. That's a value of our corporation, that we are not going to profit off slave labor. And we are going to do everything to prevent that. Now that's probably not something we're going to legislate, but that's something we're going to ask repeatedly get done. And hopefully, again, never underestimate, especially in the new era of social media, never underestimate the power of being a citizen and demanding. No one would have known about this purse globally or nationally if it hadn't been one of those Twitter or Facebook posts, right? That pretty much went viral, and everybody now says, we want something done about this. So when we see it, it's so important we say it. We say something. And I think sometimes we don't want to look at it. And we don't want to get involved, as Cindy said, but if we really are committed as fellow human beings, we didn't eradicate slavery, in 1864, slavery exists today, and we have to be willing to speak out against it and call it out when we see it. And I think that's an important thing to do.
How about on this side? Right in front of you. Great.
Hi, first of all, I just wanted to thank you both for coming here today and also for just being such wonderful advocates for this very important issue. I work with an anti-trafficking group back here at New York University, and we continuously face this challenge of conveying the importance of this issue to others, because a lot of people are kind of feel distanced to it and don't really recognize how big of an issue it is here in our country. So I was wondering, as vocal activists for this very important cause, what advice you have to young people and to people in general who are kind of trying to advocate for this cause and spread awareness for it.
You want that one, or you want me?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I'll do it too.
I am such a believer in the power of people who have a mission and a cause to really engage. And I think that that we're building an army against slavery in this country and hopefully expanding it to the world. We're building an army, and we're making it socially unacceptable. I will tell you, when you look at the example of domestic violence, have we eradicated domestic violence in the country? Absolutely not. But we have greatly diminished the numbers. And that's because we as a society, more than anything, increased prosecutions, increased awareness, all of that, but we as a society have said, that's not a family problem, that's a crime, and we're going to see it prosecuted. And this is how you recognize the issue, and this is how you recognize what's going on, and this is why you need to be the advocate for that family. And what I would say to you is that there are tons of great organizations that you can get involved in, both globally and locally. There are tons of great workers out there who are doing incredible work, and lots of opportunities to engage very broadly in this effort. But I would say that it's really important that you become educated about what it is. Just for instance, I think that there's a lot of people who get involved, and then maybe the victim goes back to the life, and you think, oh, why did I do that? Yeah. You know what? You can't give up on her, because if you give up on her, you're giving up on everybody who could come behind her. And so, that's a constant frustration, whether it's domestic violence or whether it's a lot of people who feel marginalized, who now have been thrown away and maybe found at least some structure in their life in living this life. And we have to be vigilant, and we have to stick up for victims no matter what. And that's not always easy. I will tell you that. I have a sister who basically runs the Runaway program in North Dakota. She does incredible outreach work. Her whole job is to get these kids off the street before they're recognized as vulnerable and in the life. Some of the toughest clients that she has are clients who have been, there is no trust left. They don't trust anyone. And so that recovery process is so difficult, and we have to stay in the fight.
May I also say, the issue of human trafficking is not a sexy issue. It's not one, and I'm not comparing it to, but just to give you some idea of the environment, let's say, or let's keep our rivers clean and all those things. Those are understandable and cognitive issues that you can get behind without much education on it. Human trafficking is a whole different deal. There's a huge ick factor to it when you talk about it. especially when you talk about the customers involved in this. You want to see a audience completely turn and walk out, that's the issue you start talking about. But these are necessary issues because you're talking about a basic human rights issue. You're talking about human life and the ability to live free. This is America. That's what we should be doing here. So don't give up. In fact, get mad. I tell people that all the time. Don't just take it. Get mad. We shouldn't be mad about this, that someone would abuse our children or our adults in any fashion such as this. So don't give up. We need you.
How about right here in the tie, in the center of the room?
Thank you very much, Senator Heitkamp and Mrs. McCain, for highlighting just how far we've come with addressing this issue, but for underscoring how much further we still have to go. My question is about the role of corruption in developing countries and whether or not corruption, both at the highest levels of government, but also in law enforcement, how does that hinder the ability for the United States to collaborate with them to effectively address this issue, and for also developing countries to work with one another to take a very hard, serious look at the role that corruption plays in fostering human trafficking? Thank you.
Go ahead, take it
Well,
first.
I was just going to mention that we have something called the Millennial Challenge Corporation. Are you familiar with that? Who here is familiar with? Yeah. So you know that this is an effort to avoid providing additional dollars to corrupt governments so that it would just go to the government and not to people. And this is a tough balancing act because when governments are corrupt and they fall off the list of governments that can be assisted with American aid or American intervention, it makes their population even more vulnerable. And so we have to make sure that we're working in governments if we're going to solve any kind of problem with violence. We have a great friend, Howard Buffett, who has a foundation. He works with Tony Blair, whose philanthropic efforts is all about building, eliminating corruption from governments, building institutional governments that can better respond and better react to challenges in their own countries. And so I think we have to look at that governance piece because frequently no amount of good intervention can help if the government itself is corrupt. I agree with your premise, but we have to work to build governments, and talk about hard work. That's incredibly hard work. The area that we focus a lot on, or that I focus a lot on, is Central America. And Cindy and I took a trip to Mexico.
And El Salvador.
And El Salvador. But Mexico is where we met with officials who were just at the beginning of that discussion, where they have a special unit within the Attorney General's office in Mexico that deals with violence against women and kind of that new idea that changes the culture of the government that this is unacceptable. And so I think it takes respecting people where they are, but also nudging them to understand that there is a universal morality, right? So people who will say, in fact, I was just with a friend who this weekend, we were talking about selling children. And in a country, I want to tell her story, but she said, one of the Americans who was working on an environmental issue, he goes, well, that's just what happens in this country. Right? That just, so his goal was to save the animals, and he was willing to overlook the selling of children. And we have to say there is a universal morality. We all should be bound by that universal morality, and we have an obligation when we see horrible things as citizens of the world to say those are horrible. But we have to have governments that we can work with to change those outcomes and provide that protection. I mean, look, we just talked about how difficult it is for this government to protect our government, the best government in the world, in my opinion, to protect the most vulnerable. And so, you can't do one without the other. And I would say that there's a lot of really good philanthropic efforts to build capacity, to eliminate impunity and corruption in government so that we can, in fact, do a better job protecting people. And so don't think that we've ignored the government piece.
I can, well, briefly say because there's corruption in a country, no matter what country it is, that is no reason to give up on the country. This is a slow slog, specifically on this issue. A lot of issues, but it's a slow slog. But I truly believe with the pieces that we're talking about here, we can really make a difference in this issue. But again, I understand your frustration with corruption.
First, I just want to say thank you so much for the work that you do. It's really important work, and it's also hard work. My question that I have tonight is, it has to do with sort of this. It's sort of, I feel a little controversial, but when you talk about sex trafficking, I was wondering if you could touch on the difference between sexual exploitation for sex work and I say this lightly, but voluntary sex work, because I think that there is a difference, and I know it's hard to sort of differentiate, but within that that field, I think that there's sort of this there's an idea that's perpetuated that women can't be sexual at all, and I was wondering if you could touch on that. And I know it's controversial,
No,
but I would love to hear what you have to say on it.
This is what I would say. The premise is that there's people who are voluntarily engaging in, commercial sex, and isn't this their right? Isn't this their choice? I think that if you sat down and really had a long conversation with most women who are in this life, they didn't begin believing they had a choice. I think that it is out of necessity. It is out of what's happened earlier, the trauma that they've experienced early on, and so I don't really accept the premise. I'm not saying it's impossible for anyone to make that choice themselves. I'm not saying that, and I think that we can have a debate about whether that should be a societal, a crime, or whether that's a choice that people make that we shouldn't interfere with. But I will tell you, in my experience, that is a very small sliver. And I tell you a story. Some of the most jaded people I know are cops. They see everything, right? And so I had the head of the Bureau of Criminal Investigation in North Dakota tell me how he got sensitized to this issue. And he talked about this big rash of prostitution in North Dakota, prostitution, and he would sit down, just curious, start talking to these women who had been arrested, what was their life? And every person had a story of victimization early on. And every person had a story that this wouldn't have been their life goal in any way, shape, or form, that they were, in fact, coerced, either with drugs or with what happens when people are sold into the life. And so I don't want to be disrespectful to you. I'm not saying it could never happen, but I'm telling you that's a small slice of the problem that we have.
I struggle with it.
Yeah.
Thinking.
And I think it's interesting because I think Claire, after we shut down Backpages, Claire got a lot of letters from women who said, I can't make a living now because of you. I mean, so a lot of people, she heard the reaction that you're talking about. And I just think that we have to be eyes wide open about this. And it's one of the toughest issues that we confront, which is, tell me the difference between prostitution, which people have in their mind, and trafficking. And let me tell you, there's cases that are clear, and there might be cases that are clear, but there's a whole lot of intervening events that really blur that distinction. And I have to tell you, in my mind, I'm like way over here. I think there's very little of that voluntary stuff, and I think there's a lot of life history that goes with being in this life.
I encountered legalization of prostitution, the issue, when the Super Bowl came to Arizona in 2014. We had made a huge effort as a state to help stop trafficking, to be alert, vigilant, what we do if we find it, all those things. And the Bunny Ranch people from Las Vegas decided they were going to park themselves in Arizona and follow me around, which is a new encounter for me. Bunny Ranch, for those of you who don't know, is a prostitution is legal within the city limits of Las Vegas, and this is a place that does just that. And the Bunny Ranch people wanted me to hear their argument on why we should legalize prostitution. I don't even like the word prostitution, but I'm using their words. Legalize prostitution and why this is a good thing. And I never sat down with them because I don't buy their argument, number one, but number two is, I agree with Heidi, most of these people don't enter into this because they want to. They're hurt in some way, they're trafficked, they're all these things. So it's up to us, and this is, and the other thing I want to say, this is not a sexualization of women. This is a crime. So in my opinion, I think, and I know you struggle with it, it's very evident that you do, those are some issues that you should look at with regards to whether or not it's the right thing to do, or whether it's, whether we should consider it prostitution and legal in some way or another. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Down here in the front.
I kind of want to, well, first of all, my name is Matthew Soper and I'm from Colorado. But I sort of wanted to ask you a bit of a follow-up. If you could just give a little bit of personal stories that maybe you've heard for how someone actually enters, say, the trade, or how someone actually becomes a victim. Because for example, my parents are farmers in Colorado, and we participate in the HB program. But I can't imagine not paying our farm help because they wouldn't be there the next day. So in my mind, I just kind of would like to know, how does this play out?
Well, let me talk about sex trafficking, because I did the example, of the evil forces, and I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Typically what happens is a kid runs away, and a kid's hungry and cold, and someone says, look, I'm going to take care of you. You come and live with me. The kid probably is talked into survival sex, which is, if you want to stay here, now you're my boyfriend, now you're my guy. And then pretty soon it's like it's time to, we need a little cash, we need a little something, you need to do this for our family, you need to do this for us, and then pretty much getting into the life. And if they meet with resistance, there's usually drugs and alcohol, other kinds of coercive ways to get into the life, and then they're in a whole culture, and the culture is really, I wish some of the trafficked victims were here to explain to you how you become number one and number two, and so there's a whole pecking order among the women who are trafficked by typically one man, and so how that all, and this is another reason why this is so complicated. So time comes, you need more girls. They send the girls out, the victims out to recruit. Typically go to where runaways hang out, go where marginal people hang out, say, why don't you come with me? You're hungry, you're on the street. That's why that intervention is so important for runaway and homeless youth, because they are so vulnerable to this whole pattern of attraction. And when we were in Mexico, what we would hear, and so it's different wherever you are, but in Mexico there was a whole section, of farm communities where the guy from town would show up and he'd have the nice car and the nice clothes, and he'd tell the woman, I love you, the girl, I love you, tell her parents that he's going to take her home to meet his father and his mother, and they're going to live in a big house, and boom, she's in the life in Mexico. And what we heard when we said, how do we prevent this? They said, these women have to come back and tell their stories about how they were coerced and how they were tricked into this life. And so it varies and the methods vary, but the one thing that the experts will tell you is that any display of vulnerability and you know, looking down, you know, they know how to pick their victims, and they know what it's going to take to control their victims. And so it goes back to what I was saying about power relationships. And when you take someone down, a lot of victims of trafficking have been sexual assault victims at home. They're running away from a very bad situation at home. They're already been marginalized. And so it just really, really, to understand the dynamic and suffering all that trauma makes recovery so much harder, because the trust level is to build any level of trust, and then to feel like you've lost, in many ways, your family because of the dynamic that's been built up around this culture. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to recognize it, and we have to say, look, we are not going to punish you because you have experienced the worst victimization outside of loss of life that anyone can experience in America. And I believe that. I believe being sold into sex slavery has to be the worst victimization anyone can undergo.
I agree. I also think that so many of these kids are, as Heidi mentioned, are part of the Child Protective Services. This foster care system, all those. This is an area that this country is going to have to deal with in a major way, not just for trafficking, but in general. We have an entire generation of kids that are coming through this that are being not only ill-served, but not served, and just simply disappearing and falling through the cracks. So that's something else that we as local state governments and federal governments are going to have to deal with.
And reporting of foster children who have run away.
Yeah.
I mean, all of that. And the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is doing some great work on tracking foster kids.
So we are coming up on the end of our time here, so I wanted to give you last words, to impart last words of wisdom for our audience.
I'll go first, then you. First of all, thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you to the volunteers that helped make this easy for us tonight. But most importantly, I'd like to leave you with one thing. If you can do one thing, having walked out of here, that could actually affect the life of a child, this is the area to do it in, because you will save a life. I cannot tell you the importance of being involved in this. We are in a perfect storm as a country right now, and I think as a world community on this issue. We're 10 years behind where domestic violence is right now, but people are talking about it. You're talking about it in general over the dinner table, over, in a business conversation, you're talking about it. So I encourage every one of you, if you could pick any area of this issue in human trafficking, pick it and work on it. Because we need everybody in this. And gentlemen, I'm going to look you straight in the eye. I can sing till I'm blue in the face about customers and what it is to rape a child, statutory rape, you're a pedophile, you're a child abuser, all these kinds of things. But men to men talking to men, you can play a vital role in stopping this. You can play a vital role, and I encourage you to get involved in it.
What I would say is, we're going to deal with the symptoms of this cancer for a long time, and so if we think, how do we protect and help the victims? But I'd like you to think about how we create a more resilient population to avoid victimization, how we not diminish human beings. And we've been working on a childhood trauma project, early intervention with children who have been traumatized, making sure that they get treatment for their trauma. I'm a big believer that a lot of issues that we have, pervasive poverty, emotional abuse, disruption in the family, alcohol addiction, all of the adverse childhood experiences lead to a lower resiliency for our children. And so the best thing is to avoid childhood trauma, but second best is treatment of childhood trauma that gets recognized. And so early on, making sure that we listen to kids and we believe kids when they say bad things are happening to them in their home, and that we build a more resilient population so that no matter what evil comes along, people can fight back one-on-one, but they need help right now. And so you're now the Army that we hope to continue to grow to prevent human trafficking in our lifetime and to stop human slavery in our world. So thank you so much for having me and
Thank
having
you.
Cindy, and
Thank you
had a great
very
time.
much.